welcome everybody. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on your location. My name is Patrick French. I'm the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences and Professor for the Public Understanding of the Humanities at Ahmedabad University. And we're really delighted today to be having a lecture with the eminent philosopher, Akeel Bilgrami, who is also the Sidney Morgenbesser Chair of Philosophy at Columbia University. Professor Bilgrami, I read your name a few days ago when I was reading the new intellectual biography of Edward Said. And it mentioned a conversation between the two of you where you talked about the possibility of co-teaching a course on feminism. And I'm sure there are many people who would have liked to have heard that course. And what a pity that, that it didn't happen. So a very big welcome to you to Ahmedabad University. I'm sorry it had to be in virtual form rather than in person, which I know you'd spoken about a little while ago with my colleague, Professor Akeel Bilgrami, who will be introducing you and then be taking questions from the members of the public, the students, and the professors who are here today. But first of all, I'd like to ask Mahira Nagri, who's one of our Philosophy, History and Languages students, to formally introduce Professor Akeel Bilgrami, and a big welcome to everybody else inside and out who has joined us today.
Thank you, Professor French. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mahira Nagri. I'm a second-year student of Philosophy, History and Languages at the School of Arts and Sciences, Ahmedabad University. This winter semester of 2021, as part of our core philosophy courses, we have been studying the hermeneutical theories of philosophers like Friedrich Schleiermacher, Wilhelm von Humboldt, Wilhelm Dilthey, and Friedrich Nietzsche, to mention a few. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this lecture on Gandhi's radicalism, on an enduring tradition of radical ideas in Gandhi's philosophy, paralleled with the political thought of Karl Marx and Michel Foucault, delivered by one of the world's most eminent philosophers, Professor Akeel Bilgrami. Professor Bilgrami got a first degree in English literature from Bombay University, but later turned to philosophy because he found the former too hard. He went to Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, and there he got another bachelor's degree in philosophy, politics, and economics. After writing a dissertation meaning as invariance, he received his PhD from the University of Chicago. He has relatively two independent sets of intellectual interests, first in the philosophy of mind and language, and second in political philosophy and moral psychology, especially as they surface in politics, political economy, history, and culture. He has held the Johnsonian Professorship of Philosophy and was the director of the Heyman Center for the Humanities at Columbia from 2004 to 2011, and the director of the South Asian Institute from 2013 to 2016. He currently holds the Sidney Morgenbesser Chair of Philosophy at Columbia University, and he deals with highly contested topics like the difference between self-knowledge and other sorts of knowledge, agency and the first-person point of view, and the irreducible nature of intentionality and value. His books include Belief in Meaning, Blackwell 1992, Self-Knowledge and Resentment, Howard 2006, and Secularism, Identity and Enchantment, Howard 2014. Professor Bilgrami takes Gandhi's thought as, to quote, a sustained integration of political, moral, and epistemological themes. His interest in Gandhi comes out of the desire to articulate a notion of what he calls the unalienated life that stands in opposition to modern enlightenment, to modern enlightenment thought. His work is remarkable not merely because of the wide range of topics in philosophy that he has insightfully discussed, but also for his brilliant recovery of Gandhi's philosophical aspects in conversation with critical debates within contemporary philosophy, especially the analytical tradition. Being in the nourishing academic environment of Ahmedabad University, where students are acquainted with major intellectual trends in the humanities, encouraged to question and chart out critical approaches across all areas of study, it is an honor and an opportunity to have Professor Akeel Bilgrami here with us today. I would like to invite and request Professor Apar Kumar to carry forward this conversation.
Thank you, Mahira. Mahira is a part of a cohort of absolutely excellent students that we have in philosophy at Ahmedabad University. So we're very lucky to have them. And I would now like to welcome very warmly Professor Akeel Bilgrami and invite him to deliver his lecture. The lecture will last about 45 to 50 minutes, and then there will be some time, about 30 minutes, for questions. So over to you, Professor Bilgrami.
Thank you, Apar. It's nice to see you again after all these years. I'm going to begin by comparing Gandhi with Edward Said, since his name was mentioned. You know, it's very interesting to me that Edward Said, for all his anti-imperialism, which was remarkable and very skillfully and forcefully argued, never asked the question, what is wrong with Western modernity? That is, somebody like Said's focus was always on the question, what is wrong with the way Western modernity conceives of the Orient, or what we would now call the South? But he never asked the question, what is wrong with Western modernity on its own terms? It was always how they conceived of us that concerned him, but never what is intrinsically wrong with them. In fact, Fanon never asked that question. Of the anti-imperialists from the southern countries, from the Orient, pretty much only Gandhi asked it. I mean, you know, people like Kumaraswamy and so on did ask it, but they were not, in that sense, anti-imperialist thinkers and activists in the way that Said and Gandhi and Fanon were. But why is it that Fanon and Said were totally focused on what's wrong with how they conceive of us, rather than what's wrong with them and their culture, their civilization, their outlook? So that's something really worth observing, that it takes a very special kind of confidence which Gandhi possessed. And it's not the confidence, I would say it's the confidence of a philosopher. I don't believe that Said and Fanon were philosophers in the way that Gandhi was. And that's what interests me in Gandhi, that the kind of confidence one has to ask what is wrong with a whole civilization is a question that I think philosophers would take on just by the nature of the kind of subject it is. You wouldn't expect it of literary theorists. You wouldn't expect it of political leaders and political thinkers. It's a philosophical question that Gandhi, I think, prompts Gandhi to do something that other eminent anti-imperialists never did. Now, from the South, never did. So one of the things that I want to begin with is to look at interpretations of Gandhi which are sympathetic to a left-wing point of view, and the left, as we know, was very critical of Gandhi for a very long time. E.M.S. Namboodiripad, his book is a classic critique of Gandhi from the point of view of the left. And recently you've had other eminent people like Perry Anderson and Arundhati Roy, who've been critical of him. But there has been a sort of left-wing revival of interest in Gandhi in people like Irfan Habib. But now even somebody like Irfan Habib interprets Gandhi as follows. He says Hind Swaraj represents the reactionary Gandhi, and that reactionary Gandhi then sort of took things back. He backpedaled from his reactionary views, his critique of modernity in Hind Swaraj, and through the experience of the freedom struggle that he led with such creativity and determination, he was educated by the activism of the freedom struggle to acquire more radical positions. Now, I think that is, at least as far as Gandhi's thought goes, that is to fail to show the right kind of sympathetic sympathy and produce the right kind of sympathetic interpretation. I don't think it gets its deepest intellectual or philosophical motives. What I'd like to therefore ask is it possible to see Gandhi? So the standard view, so somebody like Irfan Habib, who's trying to be sympathetic to Gandhi, sees a reactionary position in Hind Swaraj, an increasingly progressive development of views over the next 3 decades. And I'm asking the question, since I think that fails to show the right sympathy with his views, I want to ask the question, is it possible to see Gandhi's Hind Swaraj as itself being progressive? Now, a critique of modernity, one would think, how can it be progressive? Because after all, the very idea of modernity is that you've overcome the past, and to hark back to the past is reaction. So how could it be progressive? To be a progressive is to embrace modernity. So how can a critique of modernity be progressive? Well, I don't care about the word progressive. We can amicably resolve this paradox of a critique of modernity being progressive by just substituting for the word progressive the word radical. And I don't mean radical in some very general sense, attacking something from the roots. Well, fascism does that. I mean radical in the standard sense that left-wing thinkers have in mind when they think of their own position. Now, I won't deny that Gandhi was a social conservative, that Gandhi was not a revolutionary socialist. He was a social conservative in many respects. he changed his views on a very wide range of things, including caste, over the 3 decades. And in fact, that evolution of his views on caste is a rather interesting thing to track. But he was a social conservative in many respects, and he certainly was not a revolutionary socialist. So what do I have in mind by saying that even Hind Swaraj is radical in some sense? That's what I want to really try and present. So what I really want to say is, can we find a radicalism in his critique of modernity, in Swaraj, rather than, as Irfan Habib and others say, despite it? Okay, now, in my work, one dialectic by which I've pursued this question about the radical possibilities in Gandhi's anti-modernism, is to find continuities between Gandhi's opposition to features of European, or what you call Western modernity, and the opposition in the early modern period by radicals in Europe. So one way I've tried to bring out his radicalism is to see affinities between him and radicals in the early modern period in Europe. Those radicals, let's focus on England, think of the diggers, levelers, and so on, radical levelers. Those radical sects, memorably studied by Christopher Hill, they presciently foresaw the direction in which Europe was going. So let's focus on England, in which England was going. And they were alarmed by the direction in which England was going, basically in the direction of the privatization of land, capitalism, and so on, incipient capitalism, initially through agribusiness, eventually industrialization, that they were focused on a much more incipient form of capital. And radicals of that period, people like Winstanley and Bartholomew and Anthony Collins and others, they were very alarmed by the direction in which they were thinking that in the early modern period, where modernity was heading. So I'm talking about the 17th century England. And I'm claiming that you can see the affinities between Gandhi. So in my work, I've claimed that you can see the affinities between Gandhi's thinking and these early modern radicals in Europe. And so I'm going to try and unearth a radicalism in Gandhi by seeing these links, affinities between them. And I want to claim that you can only fail to see this if you, I mean, one way to see this clearly is to read Hind Swaraj as a book expressing anxiety, sometimes hysterical anxieties, about India, which Gandhi conceived, I believe, as being at the crossroads that Europe was in the early modern period. So Gandhi in 1909, when he wrote Hind Swaraj, thought India was at the crossroads that Europe was in the early modern period. And he had very similar anxieties about where India would be going as a result of the influence of its colonizers upon Indians, that the radical sects of say, England had the same anxieties about where European modernity was heading in the early modern period. I think that's a good dialectic by which to see Gandhi's radicalism initially. Now, the way I went about doing that is by looking at a remark by Amartya Sen in an essay which he published both in the Financial Times and in the Calcutta Telegraph. And if you remember, when there was a dispossession of peasantry in many parts of India, not just Bengal, as a result of what Marx called primitive accumulation, which is dispossession of what Marx called petty producers, mostly peasants. I mean, he had artisans and all in mind too, but mostly peasants. When you divorce peasants from their means of production, which is basically the land, that's what Marx called primitive accumulation. There was a widespread protest. You know, I mean, Singur and the idea of special economic zones. It's just basically eminent domain form of dispossession for corporate projects that the governments, state governments in various parts of the country was supporting. There was widespread, very honorable protest against it. Meda Patkar, Arundhati Roy, and so on, courageous, honorable protest against it. And Amartya Sen, who, you know, is one of the most humane economists, that's his reputation, it's actually said in this essay, England went through its pain to create its Londons and Manchesters. India will have to do so too. That was his response to the protests. This is one of the most humane economists writing in the mainstream of economics. Now, the question I think that's worth asking is, what is this assumption in this remark? England went through its pains to create its Londons and Manchesters. India will have to do so too. What is this assumption that what happened in England must happen in its erstwhile colonies? Where does this assumption come from? It's very widely held. I mean, Sen is just articulating a conventional view, which is very common, not just among economists, but amongst lay intellectuals. Where does this assumption come from? Now, one might think that it comes from some commitment to historical necessity, what are called iron laws of history. What happened in Europe must happen in other parts of the world, including Europe's former colonies. One might think it's a result of historical necessity or iron laws of history, as some interpreters of Marx have, I think, not very fairly or intelligently interpret Marx as saying. I don't think Sen's view comes out of any commitment to historical necessity. He's just not part of that tradition. He's part of a liberal tradition of thought. So the question is, what is prompting Sen to say it? Now, because he doesn't come from any commitment to historical necessity, as some Marxists do, I think it comes not from considerations of necessity, but from considerations of rationality. The idea is that what happened in England was rational, what happened in Europe was rational, therefore it ought to happen in Europe's erstwhile colonies. That's not necessity. That's an ought claim, a value claim. The value deriving from the rationality of what happened in Europe. Though, of course, now there's a Hegelian tradition which connects rationality with necessity, because history is tracking reason. But let's put that complication aside for the moment. Let's say that these are different positions, and Sen doesn't belong to that position anyway. He's not coming from any Hegelian tradition of that kind. So he really thinks of his position as not having nothing to do with necessity, but having to do with rationality. It's a standard liberal understanding of developments in Europe. So the question is, what is it that makes one assume that what happened in Europe was rational? What underlies that assumption? And one way to do it, one way that I've tried to do in the past is to look at the most prominent view that argued for the rationality of a certain form of privatization of land. And that's the famous chapter in the second treatise of government in Locke, where I'm going to put this in a very rough reconstruction of Locke. The argument goes roughly like this. This is presenting something as rational that was happening by brute force for some time before Locke, almost a century before Locke. And that was the system of enclosures. That is, the taking over of the commons by landed interests, privatizing the land. This was being done by brute force in this enclosures movement, and Locke presented that historical series of events, the enclosures, as a moral and political achievement. He literally rendered what was happening by brute force rational by this argument in the second treatise of government. And let me present the contractualist version of that argument very roughly, reconstructing from Locke, combining his contractualism with his argument for property, for private property. So what's the standard Lockean view? Here's a reconstruction. Imagine us, how many of us are here? Imagine that we are inhabitants of a state of nature. We convene, we consent to principles to live by, and as soon as we consent to principles to live by as a group of inhabitants of the commons, the state of nature or commons becomes a polity, and we, hitherto merely people, become citizens. That's the standard view of this. But these principles and arrangements to live by, to which we've consented, are rational if there are two conditions for their rationality. One, that we freely consent to them, and two, that we are better off than we were in the state of nature as a result of adopting those principles to live by. Okay? So it's an argument from being better off, improvement. And so Locke presents a scenario. The contractualist scenario is, here we are as a group living in the commons, inhabitants of the commons. Some of us come across, as individuals, come across stretches of land, and I fence a bit of land, Apar fences a bit of land, Patrick fences a bit of land, Sarthak fences a bit of land, and we, each one of us says this land, we register it in some kind of bureau, which we set up and declare, each one of us declares this land that I fenced to mine, Apar mine, and so on. And now there are many of us who haven't been able to do that. So we say, okay, let's hire those who have not been able to do that and offer them wages to work on my fenced land, your fenced land, etc. And they will be better off than they were in the state of nature. So everybody's better off. It's an argument from Pareto, what's called Pareto improvement. I mean, there's a slight sophisticated qualification there. The idea of Pareto improvement is many are better off, but no one's worse off. That's the thing. Okay, so so that's a familiar Lockean argument, contractualist argument. It's a rational procedure because it's a Pareto improvement over the state of nature. Everybody would rationally consent to it, freely consent to it. Now, what I do in my work on this is to present Winstanley as a radical. I put in the mouth of the radical dissenters against the enclosures, people like Winstanley and other radicals of the early modern period. I put in their mouths, quite anachronistically, partly because Winstanley preceded Locke by a few years, and also because the vocabulary I use couldn't possibly be. But economists have this idea of what is called an opportunity cost. An opportunity cost is when if you make a choice, then some benefits which you would otherwise have had are avoided for you. So it's an opportunity cost of a decision that some benefits you could have had, you don't have. So here would be a radical objection to Locke's argument that I've just presented. So let's put in the mouth of Winstanley, I say in some of my work, an argument from opportunity cost, which says to Locke, yes, you're right, that we would be better off than we were in the state of nature if we consented to this privatization of the land and the hiring of wage labor to work on the land by those who have not taken possession of any land. That makes everybody better off than they were in the state of nature, but it doesn't make them better off than they would have been if the land had not been privatized in the first place and there was a collective cultivation of the commons instead. Right? So it's an opportunity cost argument. True, we're better off than we were in the state of nature, but not what we would have been if we had not privatized the land at all and had a collective cultivation of the commons. Okay, you can't stop there, however, because all of the thinking behind political economy or liberal political economy, which Sen is deriving, Sen puts constraints on it, social democratic constraints on it, as we know. His big quarrel with my colleague Jagdish Bhagwati is precisely that he wants to put social democratic constraints on it, whereas Bhagwati is in for this much more crude form of hell-bent for leather growth. So, but still, putting social democratic constraints on it are just constraints on a way of thinking that's already in place. So Winstanley can't be the resting point. But the argument I put in Winstanley's mouth can't be the resting point in this dialectic, because subsequent centuries of political thought, thought about political economy, has tried to fortify Locke's argument by saying that the commons, the very idea of the collective cultivation of the commons, is a hopeless idea. It's not a cogent idea, because the commons is doomed to tragedy. The collective cultivation of the commons is doomed to tragedy. This is a famous argument. I mean, it's Garrett Hardin was his famous essay in Science magazine is just one articulation of it, but it's basically summarizing up centuries of liberal thought about the political economy. And it's a very simple argument. You know, there's all this fancy footwork. It's a multi-person prisoner's dilemma argument. It's it's basically a game theoretic argument appealing to multi-person prisoner's dilemma. It's a very simple idea. The idea is that here we are all in the commons. If you think that we can collectively cultivate it, then each person has to see the rationality in that collective cultivation. But they soon realize that if we're going to collectively cultivate the land, each one of us has to pay a certain cost. Mostly the cost when it comes to pastoral or agricultural land, but any commons, even the fresh air commons, mostly the cost is you have to show some restraint. You can't allow your cattle to graze all day. You just can't keep over-cultivating and ruin the soil. You can't overfish the oceans, right? You can't run your air conditioner all day when it's summer, because you ruin the atmosphere. So the costs of cooperation are often restrained, but they're costs. All cooperation in the commons, collective life, requires paying some costs. But now the argument goes, this pro-Lockean argument against the Winstanley view, which presupposes a coherent idea of cultivation of the commons. The idea is each person has to ask, should I cooperate? Should I pay the cost of cooperation? And when each person asks that, each person will think, well, wait, if I don't cooperate, all the gains will be for me. Whereas if I cooperate, the gains will be spread over everybody. So it's true, if everybody cooperates, everybody gains. But if I don't cooperate, the gains will be all for me. If I cooperate, the gains will be spread over the group. If I don't cooperate, the gains will be immediate to me. Whereas if I do pay the cost of cooperation, the gains will be over a long period. So it's looking quite attractive to not cooperate already. But the crucial question is, what if I cooperated and others didn't? That's the deep epistemological anxiety. I don't know that others will cooperate. And if I cooperate and others don't, that's the worst possible option for me. Right? If I pay the cost and others don't, it's the worst option for me. So, not cooperating, the gains are immediate and all to myself. And the clinching consideration, the crucial considerations, I don't know that others will cooperate. And that's a disaster for me. So it would be rational to not cooperate. But if each individual thinks this way, the commons are ruined. That's the tragedy of the commons. So it's a multi-person prisoner's dilemma. This is how one thinks in a prisoner's dilemma, in a multi-person prisoner's dilemma. And so the game theoretic updating of Locke says, you know, it's doomed to tragedy, this nutty idea of collective cultivation of the commons. Privatization is a better bet. Locke was right after all. That's the game theoretic updating of the Lockean contractualist argument. And in my dialectic, I've pitted it against a Winston radical dissenting response. Okay, now that's all by way of setup. I'm sorry that I haven't even got. Now, what I want to say is that all of Gandhi's thinking about ashram life, about the nature of popular religion, etc., were targeting this central thought that drives the underlying thinking of political economy that supports Locke, and which Sen is simply assuming in his remark when he criticized the critics of primitive accumulation, of dispossession, right? And all of Gandhi's thinking about the nature of ashram life was, if you have the anxiety, what if I cooperated and others didn't? You are a deeply alienated person. To even have that qualm is a manifestation of how alienated you are from, socially alienated each individual is. And that is exactly how, I mean, Marx had a very detailed account of the alienation of labor, but Marx also thought that the capitalist class, the managerial class, all these people were alienated too. So he had to have a more general idea of alienation than just the conditions of the laboring classes. And this is the idea. So let me define for you what I mean by alienation. What I mean by alienation, for the purposes of my dialectic, right? I mean, I'm happy to talk about alienation and all sorts of other, but in the dialectic I've set up, I'm defining alienation as the very sort of thing that prompts one to ask, what if I cooperated and others didn't? So the ideal of an unalienated life is that that thought never occurs to one. You're unalienated if it never occurs to you to ask. By the way, this is not a moralistic critique of self-interest. It's a cognitive point. To be unalienated is a cognitive achievement, an epistemological achievement. The idea is the thought doesn't occur to one. It's not the idea of saying the thought ought not to occur to one. No. If you're unalienated, the thought doesn't occur to you. It doesn't compute in your thinking. Okay, so it's a cognitive point. It's not the familiar critique of self-interest. I mean, Gandhi was an incessant moralist, but when he said, it never occurs to anyone in an ashram life to have anxieties like, what if I swept in the morning, but nobody else did their bit, etc. Right? When he says, it just never occurs to people. That's the point. He's absolutely clear. It never occurs to people to be anxious about that sort of thing. It's the anxiety which drives all of the thinking of political economy. Right? And I'm saying that ideal of an unalienated life is what makes him and Marx intellectual partners. Right? Despite all the differences between them. Right? That they believe that modernity, that the economic and political outlooks that emerged in the developments of modernity have generated a mentality. That's why I call it cognitive achievement, to not have that anxiety. It's generated a mentality. A great deal of Hind Swaraj is about the cognitive and effects of mentality that come from capital and these growth economies, etc., etc. Okay. So that's the background of, that's been my work so far in setting up things to see the affinities between radicals in the early modern period, people like Marx in the early Marx, what is called early Marx. I believe this element is there throughout Marx, all the way to his very late work on the Russian peasant communes. But anyway, so these are the affinities with radical traditions in. Now, I want to go beyond what I've said in my work so far in this lecture and ask a further question. So far, I've been giving a philosophical critique of the assumptions in Amartya Sen's remark and trying to show where Gandhi enters to bring in the idea of alienation and the unalienated life as a political ideal, to bring out his radicalism or his affinities with radicals in the Western tradition. And I should point out that the only reason why people don't actually link Gandhi with people like Winstanley and so on is because they just think Winstanley is lost art. All those radicals lost art. But that couldn't possibly be relevant to interpreting what he wrote in 1909, because he really did think that India was in the position that Winstanley's England was in the 17th century. I mean, he hadn't read Winstanley, but what Europe was in the early modern period. Okay, so now what I want to ask is, forget about the philosophical critique for the moment that I've just given. What about just the empirical, historical critique of Sen? I mean, Sen's remark is wrong in more than one way, because I think Gandhi, the Gandhian view, and Gandhi's understanding of this was not just this kind of philosophical critique that I'm deriving from the idea of his remarks, which I see as remarks about alienation, what I described about ashram life, and which he thought was, by the way, everywhere present in communities of popular religion. Okay. The empirical thing that's wrong with Sen, and it should be obvious, it's remarkable that it wasn't obvious to Sen, is that as a historical analogy with London's and Manchester's in England, it is historically very inexact. Because when people were dispossessed in Europe, when people were dispossessed in England to create its Londons and Manchesters, they moved in very large numbers to other parts of the temperate belt, to Canada, USA, to North America, to the Antipodes, to the southern tips of Africa. Very wide range of massive migration occurred when people were dispossessed of their land in this what is called primitive accumulation, just taking over land for private, what we now call agribusiness, the enclosures and so on. So where are the poor of Chhattisgarh and Singhu and Bengal, where are the rural poor going to go? You've got immigration laws. They can't just move in massive numbers to other parts of the world. What is he talking about? How can you make a historical analogy omitting the fact that then there was a kind of mobility of labor which is simply missing now? Okay, so now, what I want to say is that Gandhi's is not just a philosophical critique, it's a very shrewd understanding that certain aspects of Marx's account of primitive accumulation just cannot apply to large agrarian economies of the South. So in order to bring this out, let me present a counterfactual. Suppose all those massive numbers of peasants who moved to the Americas and the Antipodes and Southern Africa and so on, suppose all of those massive numbers of peasants did not move. They were sedentary in Europe. Now, look at Marx's account of primitive accumulation. Marx says in part 8 of Capital, chapter 27, part 8 discusses enclosures, but part 8 in general discusses the very idea of dispossession of land for privatization and private projects. He calls it primitive accumulation. And Marx claimed that primitive accumulation he said it was brutal and coercive, but he did also say in those very passages in part 8 of volume 1 of Capital, he does say that it has a certain ideal of progress, because when you have primitive accumulation, all sorts of bad things like hierarchies based on primordial ties, religion, in our country, caste, race, things like that, divisions based on religion and hierarchies based on primordial ties of that kind, they are overcome by primitive accumulation because you have these growth economies, which eventually end up in industrial growth and so on. But you have these growth economies, and a new form of labor is created, which is wage labor, industrial labor. Metropoles are created. I mean, basically, cities, the general pattern is that cities emerge because of agricultural surpluses, which then have to go somewhere, and they go into the creation of cities, etc. So Marx's idea was that with primitive accumulation, you get these surpluses in agriculture, which then give rise to cities and so on. This is just what Sen is assuming. And so you get these growth economies, eventually industrial growth economies, etc. New products emerge, new consumers have to be cultivated. So you have advertising and so on to bring it. So you get what we call modernity of that kind. But he says that's terrible because all sorts of bad things happen, new forms of exploitation, alienation occurs amongst all that happens. But the old primordial ties and the hierarchies and divisions, those go away. Right? A new community emerges, new form of economic formation, new class formation emerges, new exploitations, new forms of oppression emerge, but the old ones go away. Right? So that's part of the progressivist claims in Marx. But now take my counterfactual. What if those people were sedentary and they couldn't move as they can't? What would have happened to them? Would they have overcome their primordial ties? What if those millions of peasants just simply stayed in Europe and couldn't go? There was no diffusion of capitalism to North America, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and so on. Would they have overcome? So, I mean, notice the fact that Marx's idea of primitive accumulation is an absolutely local observation about Europe. European labor could migrate. European peasantry could migrate. But if you take my counterfactual, and if they couldn't migrate, if they were sedentary, why would you expect the primitive, the primordial ties and all the divisions and hierarchies to disappear? Now, what is counterfactual in Europe, as I've just presented it, is they're factual in India and in the southern economies of the colonies. You can't migrate anywhere. So what I'm presenting as a counterfactual for Europe is the factual or actual in India. And Gandhi's point was not just a moralist. I mean, Gandhi did have a normative position saying we should try and overcome the bad things in caste and religion, religious divisions and all, but without creating these new economies and new class formations. He did have that normative position. But I'm saying he also just simply had a shrewd perception that it was not going to happen anyway. It couldn't happen anyway. It's just not the nature of colonialism to have the economies of the South develop in the same ways that they couldn't. So it's not just a matter of they shouldn't overcome their primordial ties by creating new class formations. Gandhi did say things like that. But I'm suggesting that that is contextualized by the fact that they wouldn't. Marx's point about primitive accumulation overcoming primordial ties is a local observation about Europe. It has no generality. It has no telos. Because you cannot replicate the non-mobility. You cannot replicate the massive mobility of labor that Europe had as a possibility in other parts of the world at other times. So it is a local observation about Europe. If you want an actual, vivid example of provincializing Europe, that's it. This is, what I'm claiming is an actual instance, not just an airy-fairy bit of theory. It's an actual instance of provincializing Europe. Marx's claim is a local, provincial observation about European history. It's got no generality, no theoretical force. It has no telos whatsoever. There's nothing general about Marx's theory of primitive accumulation. It's an absolutely provincial, local observation about Europe at a particular time, early modern Europe. Gandhi understood this extremely well. So his moralism about, no, let's not have this, is also, you're not going to get it anyway. Okay, so that's one range of thinking. Now, what is interesting to me is that having pointed this out, that his radicalism is not just a moralistic critique, but a shrewd understanding of imperialism's inability and refusal to have the rest of the world develop along the lines that Europe could develop. I'm not making the usual point that it was extractive and colonialism is extractive and so on. All that is true. I'm just saying that the historical analogy is wrong in sen, and so that implies certain things about what is meant by primitive accumulation, and the progressivism in Marx is not a bit of theory. It's just an observation about Europe. Okay, now let me present a couple of objections to what let me say just two or three things about this interpreting Gandhi along these radicalist anti-imperialist lines. Let me try and present what I think is a standard objection to finding something like Hind Swaraj and its critique of modernity radical in the ways that I've tried to do. See, it's absolutely, this is such an insistent critique that it's very standard indeed. And no doubt Sen was making partly this critique of the protesters of the primitive accumulation in India. But the standard view is, look, you've tried to show affinities between Gandhi and radicals of the early modern period, but those radicals lost out. And the idea that one should appeal to them to talk of radicalism means precious little if it's a kind of nostalgia for things that have lost out. Now, one hears this all the time. This is just a completely standard critique of, and I think it's interesting to try and respond to it, partly because it's brings out some of the strengths of Gandhi's radicalism, or some of the details of his radicalism. This argument from nostalgia, it's, the argument is, the idea of nostalgia here is just the idea that it's too late, right? If something is too late to recover, or something is too late to see as a model for developing an alternative, then it's nostalgia to appeal to it in the way that I've done in my finding the radicalism in Gandhi. Well, just ask the question. Well, first of all, this stuff about nostalgia, I mean, there is medieval scholastics called any effort at creativity in the Renaissance nostalgic for a bygone classical era. The Renaissance occurred. So people should be reminded of that. But also, it's a very selective, ideologically selective, what gets called nostalgic and what doesn't. Right? So everybody is saying now, many people are saying now, you can't go back to 1967 borders in Israel. It's too late, there are too many settlements. Typical. You just can't do it, it's too late. Okay, if that's too late, why didn't, when the Soviet Union took over private property and private capital, and so did all the countries behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet satellite countries, why didn't people in the West say, it's too late, private property is a thing of the past in that region of the world? It's too, why didn't they say that? Why not? You say it about Israel, you say it about this, that, and the other, about collective cultivation of the commons, etc. But why didn't you say it about the Soviet Union and that region of the world where private property was abolished? Why not? Why didn't you say, you can't go back to private property, it's that part of the world, it's gone? You never said that. Instead, you unrelentingly, you untold violence in Southeast Asia and Latin America constantly, until every such experiment of the abolition of private property fell apart. So it's highly selective what you find too late and what you find. But I want to actually say that quite apart from the bad motives in calling things nostalgic, the ideologically selective nature of such accusations, Gandhi had a very, very clear view of what he thought was radical politics and why it was not nostalgic. And I think it's worth bringing out what his response to such charges were. And I think that my way of framing his view is to say that the reach of modernity is not comprehensive. In fact, part of the what I call the hysterical nature of his anxieties in Swaraj is that he thought the reach of modernity is not comprehensive and we shouldn't allow it to be comprehensive. And that's why he was so harsh. And to this day, the reach of modernity is not comprehensive. And what do I mean by that when it comes to these questions? Well, remember, what I've said was a very appealing and central strand of Gandhi's radicalism is his idea of an unalienated life. And I think he wanted to say that the way I would present it is to say that we go in and out of alienation, and we don't even know that we are. When we are in it, we don't even know that we are at other moments not in it, and vice versa. So let me present this. It's what psychologists, well, it's actually a term from mathematical logic, but psychologists then adopted it. It's called the frame problem, very familiar to people who. The frame problem is that we have ways of thinking and responding to the world, but they're very different and they're often even inconsistent. Each one of us has very inconsistent ways of thinking and responding, but we don't even realize we're being inconsistent because each of the two inconsistent thoughts is in different frames that are completely insulated from each other. So we can't even recognize that there's a contradiction or inconsistency because the two frames are sealed off from each other. You can only have consistency and inconsistency. You can only assess thoughts for consistency and inconsistency if you have a unified frame and you can see the inconsistent. But if the two inconsistent thoughts occur in two different frames in a agent, then from the point of view of the agent, the first person point of view, the two frames, the two thoughts don't get felt or seen as inconsistent. Okay, so here an example that I've given before in a lecture is of a frame. I'm not talking about alienation for a moment. I'm just giving a different kind of example. Example that I like to give is the same person. Let's say a person is driving through Harlem, which is very close to my city flat, and suppose she sees all sorts of poverty and homelessness and so on, and she says, "Oh, that's terrible. We must do something about it." And then you ask her, "Well, okay, shall we have public expenditure and improve the lives of these people, give them housing?" And she says, "Are you mad? Absolutely not." She doesn't even know she's being inconsistent because in one frame, she's just responding with quotidian compassion. Every day she sees something she wants, she feels genuinely upset. She thinks in another frame, a frame reading mainstream economics, etc., etc. She says, absolutely not. If it was a unified frame, she might see it as inconsistent, but she's just thinking in two frames. Right? Now, I think Gandhi thought that we go in the same way. There are some frames in which we are totally unalienated. He says, in an ashram, it never occurs to me to worry about whether other people are paying the cost of doing their bit. Right? Never occurs to me to ask. Never occurs to me to ask it of my daughter, my son, my family. But there are many contexts in which I do ask it. I do have that anxiety. Right? And I don't even know that I'm being inconsistent. But he really wants to say that in many contexts of village communities of popular, tied with kinship ties based on popular religion, in families, in neighborhoods of various kinds, ashrams, one never asks the question that manifests this alienation of modernity. What if I cooperate? In many contexts, one does. In many frames, one does. And one does not know one's being inconsistent. But right now, not in some bygone era for which one is nostalgic, right now, one is thoroughly unalienated in many, many contexts and frames. Right now, there's nothing nostalgic about it. So, what is Gandhi's conception of politics? Gandhi's conception of politics is that it is the task of politics to raise consciousness such that the boundary between these frames is removed, and one has a single frame, a unified frame. One recognizes one's inconsistencies, and it's the part of the public education of mobilizations that he was in, is to educate, is to bring about a consciousness in which perhaps the frames in which one is unalienated provide the critical resources to make criticisms of the frames in which one is alienated and come to a position on the more public matters and so on where the alienated thinking occurs. So his conception of politics is that people's consciousness needs to be in a unified frame so that things that they very naturally do in quotidian contexts provide the critical resources for what they do when they're making policies, et cetera, et cetera. And right now that's possible because right now the reach of modernity is not comprehensive, and there are many frames in which we think in an unalienated way. So that is his conception of politics. Okay, I suppose I should be answering other charges about his anti-modernisms, reactionariness. I don't know how much time do I have apart. Should I stop and take questions, or?
Yeah, I think maybe you can stop here and
Okay.
take questions now.
Okay, so I just, those latter remarks were meant to respond to the charge of nostalgia, saying that right now we have the resources in some frames to be completely unalienated, and it's the goal of politics to scale those up in some way, but first by removing the boundaries between frames. And that gives the mobilizations of politics a very different task before it seeks material transformations of consciousness raising. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Bilgrami, for this wonderful talk. And we have time for questions, about 20 to 25 minutes for questions. So you can please send me your questions to me privately over chat. But in some cases, we might also have people asking their own questions. So I have one question here, so we can begin with that. And the first question is from Dr. Roshni, who says, defending Gandhi's position of anti-Western modernity, you signaled in the beginning of your lecture about an incipient modernity that was underway in India before the advent of colonialism. Could you please pinpoint its features of rationality that would have enabled one to recognize this modernity in the absence of the Western one?
So, no, the incipient modernity in India was the one that was being shaped by the colonizers in shaping the mentalities of the colonized. So my view is that his alarms about modernity were that colonialism was, and it was, many people around him. I mean, after all, so much of the national movement was not based on mass mobilization, but on making piecemeal constitutional demands. It was a very lawyerly movement till he came back from South Africa. And that was part of the way of thinking that he was wanting to finesse. And so his anxieties were precisely the anxieties of the early modern radicals, which is the incipient modernity in India was alarmingly taking the direction that the colonizers' influence on the colonized was shaping.
Okay. So I have another, we can have Professor Marianne Chaco from the School of Arts and Sciences would like to ask a question. So Marianne, you can, I think, let me see. Yeah, I think I've unmuted you. Have I?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Good morning, Professor Bilgrami. Nice to see you again. I had a question regarding the, what I'm understanding is that the ashram is a space where an unalienated space. The ashram as an unalienating space where you don't have, the particular kinds of thoughts that you said would not occur in the space of the ashram. But I was also wondering if ashram is the space where Gandhi saw one could work through the ruptures between frames. And I was thinking of that particular incident of Kasturba Gandhi not wanting to clean toilets and Gandhi insisting that she does. So I was wondering if that comes from a sense of alienation and if the ashram is a space where one works through that alienation. And
yeah, well, inhibitions from doing something which are in some sense associated with lower castes and so on, isn't an example of the anxiety that's part of this alienation that I'm talking about, which is the anxiety is, what if I cooperated and others did not? Right? That's the anxiety. That's not Kasturba's anxiety, right? So it's a different phenomenon. I mean, he's just asking her to overcome the primordial ties, which makes her think of, certain hierarchical conception of caste. I mean, Gandhi never overturned in the first 2 decades after he came back, he wasn't wanting the annihilation of caste, as he began to say he did by the 40s. But he, in those first 2 decades, he did think that the caste system was part of the fabric of Indian society, but he absolutely insisted that it was a caste as heterogeneity and not caste as hierarchy. That was, yeah.
Okay. Questions? Other questions? You can raise your hand as well. Yeah, Ashwin, I'm going to unmute you. Ashwin Kumar is another professor at the School of Arts and Sciences. Ashwin, can you ask your question?
Thank you, Professor Bilgrami, for that talk. I was wondering about just give me a second. I'm trying to if that's possible. Okay. Now, I was wondering about the unalienated life itself. Now, if you were to take Hardin's example, or even Gandhi's, there seems to be some deep connection between this state of being unalienated and received traditions of living. So I couldn't quite place the received traditions part in this context in your conversations. Also, going by some of your responses to Marianne just now, that how does one even think of an unalienated life in the absence of seeing the world as bequeathed?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's a hard question. And you see, everybody who writes about alienation. Every major thinker who has written on alienation, whether it's Rousseau or Hegel or Marx or Sartre, right? They all agree that alienation is a malaise of modernity. I mean, that's just completely, there's almost total consensus on that. So for instance, a serf or even a slave, however oppressed they were, right? However horrible the defects of pre-modern societies, slave societies or feudal societies of serf labor were, however horrible they were, alienation was not one of the horrible things that they suffered from. Even serfs and slaves had a sense of belonging, right? No matter how much else they suffered from, those societies had horrible defects, but this was not one of the defects, right? Now, obviously, if one is talking about the unalienated life in the way that Marx and Gandhi are, the idea of the unalienated life as a political ideal can't be a revival of that, right? Because the unalienated life of pre-modern times was accompanied by those other flaws. So for instance, the Enlightenment introduced great ideals of liberty and equality, partly to overcome those other ideals. But Marx's point was, and Gandhi's point, see, it's very interesting that neither Marx nor Gandhi have any real admiration for liberty and equality as ideals. Marx, on the Jewish question, rejected them as bourgeois ideals. And nowhere does Gandhi emphasize the rights that come with for liberty and equality and so on. It's just not part of what he thinks is essential. They both stress the unalienated life instead. But precisely because the unalienated life they are stressing can't be the unalienated life of previous times, what I think our job as philosophers, as political thinkers and so on, is to see how it is that the inadequacies of liberal and Enlightenment thinking about liberty and equality are removed if one does introduce the notion of an unalienated life, right? But at the same time, it can't be the unalienated life for pre-modernity because liberty and equality, introducing them is an advance on the pre-modern times where unalienated life existed without them. So what we need is a triangular transformation of liberty, equality, and the unalienated life. The last of these can't be the same as pre-modern times. The liberty and equality can't be what it is for the Enlightenment liberal, because it's the inadequacies that Marx and Gandhi. And so you've got to change all three at once. In a way, a lot of my work on Gandhi and Marx is really doing the task. So I really like your question very much because it's putting your finger on the fact that you can't just talk of the unalienated life, as I did in this lecture, my other writings are, but you've got to see it nesting with liberty and equality now. And once you do, you can see the force of Marx and Gandhi in a way that corrects for the inadequacies of the Enlightenment at the same time as it transcends the notion of unalienatedness of pre-modern times.
Okay. We have a question from Professor Geeta Ramana, who says, so would unalienation be another way for arguing for cultural continuity? If so, how should we look at the Indian Renaissance, as some call the period that challenges the colonial influence that seems to have created the seeds of some alienation?
Right. So the word culture here is very important, I think, because it is absolutely true that for somebody like Gandhi, culture or civilization was the paramount category. See, he was not thinking of it from the point of view of the state. You can think of society from the point of view of the state, but he was thinking of society as civilization and culture. Right? Why? Well, because the state is often authoritarian, as we've seen in the last few years in our own country. And moreover, in our own country, since 1990, for instance, the state is completely fused with capital. I mean, to some extent, it was always fused with capital, but it's just shameless, open, and unconstrained since 1990. And so, in a way, the state's point of view, when you give the narratives of Indian society and Indian history from the point of view of the state, right, of modern Indian post-independence, from the point of view of the state, there is a real sense in which there will be all the points about mentality, alienation will not so much as be visible that Gandhi is making. So really, what I think is going on is that he's stressing, he's saying, just forget about the state, forget about ideals of constitutions, liberty, equality, and all. Think of things from the point of view of our civilization, our culture. You know, I mean, Gandhi never, just yesterday I was speaking about art and so on, but Gandhi did not have a very explicit aesthetic, philosophical outlook. But Gandhi's stress on civilization and culture, which I think in our understanding of civilization and culture includes art and so on, is really to present a narrative or a way of thinking that just simply finesses state and capital. It says, I don't have to think from the point of view of the state and capital. I just don't have to do it. There's nothing compulsory about thinking of things from that point of view. And if you do things from that point of view, you will not get the category of alienation coming out. You'll get constitutional provisions about liberty, equality, and all, but alienation will just disappear. Marx, I don't believe Marx did not think you could get an unalienated ideal in place without having a classless society. But those who do not stress the unalienated life in Marx, those people like Althusser who reject the early Marx, right? They don't have any answer to the fact that Marx himself would have seen the achievement of a classless society as just a bit of social engineering if it was not in the service of an unalienated life. It would be just more politics as usual, state-oriented, etc. It would be no achievement, even a classless society would be no achievement if you didn't have these much wider categories which involve emotion, non-discursive elements, non-representational elements, what Nietzsche called the Dionysian elements. Right? When Nietzsche said the Apollonian or the representational element has a Dionysian background, otherwise it couldn't even be what it is. That's what I'm saying is the idea of the unalienated, which brings into relief and even for Marx, what classless societies are, what liberty or equality is, etc. Without it, it's nothing. It's the only thing from the point of view of social engineer, the state, capital, etc. Even when you overcome capital, you haven't really overcome it. And I think that's the point. I mean, I think that's the point. In my view, that's the point of art. That's the point of culture. It's exactly what Nietzsche called the indispensability of the Dionysian. And I didn't get to Foucault because I ran out of time. But you see, I think that Foucault had it wrong in the sense that Foucault really thought that there were large epistemes right, which replaced each other. And so you had, so for instance, Foucault talks of how a certain kind of humanity, an emotively grounded, discretionary, non-discursive element just disappeared with Enlightenment penality. This is discipline and punishment. You got a disciplinarity. You got punishment via a codified law. The magistrate of old regime, ancien regime, could not any longer have the discretionary things like in Les Miserables, you know, you've got to get that guy. He stole that loaf of bread. You've got to get him. The law says it. Your magistrate has no discretion to say, oh, let the guy go. Come on, it was so many years ago. It was just a loaf of bread. No, the law says it. Right? So Foucault's idea is all this non-discursive discretionary element just goes away when you have the law, the codified, constitutionally enshrined, propositional, discursive field of enlightenment. Other things too, but penality in this particular book. And I don't, if I'm right, it's not as if the discretionary element, the unalienated element goes away. It's always there. There's, you know, there is no replacement of one episteme by another. There is in all sorts of quotidian, and that's Gandhi's point, in all sorts of quotidian things, in the ashram, in the village communities of popularity, the unalienated thing is there right now. The reach of modernity is not comprehensive. So I would reformulate Foucault's anxieties in a quite different way along Gandhian lines than he himself did. And I think that's part of the Nietzschean point about Dionysian. That's where culture is extremely important. It just is a counter outlook, a counter narrative to the state.
Professor French has a question.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Apa. So I know that we're just going over time, so I'll try and frame it very briefly. I was curious about...
Can you speak louder, Patrick? I can't hear you.
Okay, are you hearing me okay now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was curious about once you put Gandhi's writing or thinking into a biographical setting. So I was thinking of Hind Swaraj. He'd just started setting up his ashrams in South Africa. He'd gone to, sort of on behalf of the Indian community in Natal for negotiations in London. He writes it on board ship. I'm then thinking also again with the autobiography and what, the circumstances in which he writes that. And I guess that quite often when he's talking about ashram life, you know that in the biographical background, there are all sorts of quarrels going on between him and the different people in the ashram. There are a lot of very alienated people within that, idealistic setting. And then in the same way, once you get to the autobiography, often his account of what was happening, which was done from memory 8 or 10 years later, is really significantly different from the version of truth, if you like, experiments with truth, that others have, or the kind of chronology that has been offered of that time. And so I was curious really about whether, the capacity to hold contrary views at once that all of us have psychologically, or the idea of the unalienated life and the unified frame, sort of where he himself fits into that.
Well, I do think that some of these ideas came from maybe initial troubles in ashrams. If you look at his collected works, from time to time, he does reprimand people around him for thinking in alienated ways. After all, you must remember that in a way, when one says, you see, I've often written about the incident when I've often spoken about it. I've written about it once, but I've spoken about the incident in which my father once told me when I was when he asked me, we came across a wallet with money, and he said, why shouldn't we take this? And I said, we should take it. And he said, why should we take it? And I said, because if we don't take it, somebody else will take it. And he responded by saying, if we don't take it, nobody else will take it. Right? And I see that as him saying, the unalienated person doesn't have the thought you have. If we don't take it, somebody else will take it. He just doesn't have that thought. That's what he was expressing. Now, what is interesting is that when he says, if we don't take it, nobody else will, it's not a prediction. He's not saying it from the third person point of view, right? He's not saying, I mean, if it was a prediction, it might even be a very naive thing to say, right? That if we don't take it, nobody else. It might be a very naive form of optimism. But it wasn't as if he was in a detached, third person way, making an observation about people. He was rather saying, let's see things this way, right? It's a stance. And so Gandhi, in a way, through the exemplarity of saying, let's see things this way, came across people who didn't see these things that way. But then I think through sheer example, the ashrams evolved into the sorts of things he was saying there were. So you're quite right to stress that from time to time, he comes across people, he thinks the exemplary would just, and so you're quite right to stress the fact that probably this was in the end an achievement over time. You can't leave that out, sure.
Well, I have a quick question, and then there are lots of questions. So I don't know how much time we have, but I have a quick question. So the way I see you thinking about the unalienated life is in a very particular context. It's the context of the Enlightenment, context of people who are opposing the Enlightenment and so on. And then, of course, the example that you work with, and it's like an argument by analogy, the example that you work with is the ashram, which of course has its own dynamics, own mechanics, its own history, and so on. But what if we consider the question and again, philosophically, and so I'm not really sort of talking about the empirical part of your talk, which is the philosophical part of the talk. What if we said that, yeah, of course, there are all these instances of unalienated life, but the register of the political, so the point I was trying to make was your argument is, in a sense, ultimately contextual in the context of the Enlightenment and so on, to or pro or contra, whatever you wish. But I'm saying, what, philosophically speaking, the more interesting question, or at least for some people, the most interesting question here would be that this whole notion of the unalienated life, however you want to give it content, is somehow absolutely not, it just doesn't apply to the register of the political, right? So the idea is that, yeah, of course, there may be moral thinkers, there may be Rousseau, there may be Marx, there may be perhaps a Gandhi, but these are all romantics of a certain sort. They're sort of moralistic thinkers, and they have these ideals, and that's okay, it's there, fine. No. But the political is not amenable to to any kind of exemplification of the unalienated life. How would Gandhi respond to that?
Well, I mean, I think the two things to say. The main thing to say is that the concept of the political divides into politics from the point of view of state and capital, and the concept of politics from the point of view of participation. Mm-hmm. These are two completely different ideas of politics. I think this distinction recurs again and again it recurred in the freedom movement. Right? I mean, in the freedom movement, I believe, I mean, we've spent literally a century, something like 70, 80 years, trying to figure out the failure of partition. Why did the partition occur, despite all the efforts of some of the central leadership of the freedom struggle? Why did it occur? Partly, I think my own diagnosis of it in very recent work is that when the freedom struggle thought of Hindus and Muslims from the point of view of the outlook of the state, you saw them in terms of political representation, leaders standing for the interests of their community, Hindus, Muslims, etc. And when there was that form of negotiation, right, you found that those Muslims just felt completely, always, that felt that they lost out in that form of negotiation, done in terms of politics understood as representation, right? You know, we, the leaders who will represent, will sit in roundtable conferences, we will talk to each other, with representatives talking, etc. The whole point of much of Gandhi and Nehru's and others' thinking was, no, the negotiation has to take place in movements. See, there are two notions of negotiation. I keep saying this in my writing. The two notions of negotiation. One is when leaders or representatives, understood in terms of politics, state, etc., negotiate. Then there's another notion of negotiate in phrases like, she negotiated the traffic. That's the kind of negotiation that takes place in participatory politics, right? In movements, in mobilizations and so on. And while, if you look at the Khilafat movement, you look at the Muslim Mass Contact Program, all these things, this is where Muslims felt completely part of the anti-imperialist movement. It's only when they were sitting, when their leaders were sitting with other Hindu leaders and so on, Congress leaders, and they felt, oh God, we're never going to get anywhere. They're always going to be the ones who win, etc. Right? So there are two conceptions of politics: the mobilizational, the participatory, etc., the representative, the state thing, and now increasingly state and capital just have joined, right? In at least since 1990, but probably ever since 47. And so the two different narratives. And I really feel something like Nietzsche is Birth of Tragedy, not late Nietzsche, but Birth of Tragedy is a very insightful way in which, and Foucault just taps it in the wrong way, I feel. But the right way to do it is to say the non-representational, right? The non-discursive, the emotive, the mythical, the Bhakti Sufi stuff about, all the, I mean, just look at the posters that 2 winters ago that the young people, the Muslims and young women and men who are protesting the CAA and NRC and so on, is completely appealing to, poetry, myth, and so on, even as they were arguing for constitutional principles of secularism and so on. It was just part of an appeal that was non-discursive. And I really think that participatory element, when it went away and all of it was left to leaders to negotiate, partition was inevitable.
Okay.
And alienation is part of a understanding of politics that is not got to do with that. That's why I keep saying that even Marx, when he saw the classless society as a necessary condition, he could not see it as a resting point, because if it was not for an unalienated life, it would just be an absolutely trivial achievement. From Marx's point of view, it would be a trivial achievement. Just a bit of social engineering, high-class social engineering, right? The culmination of Marx, Althusser's Marx.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's one more question from Payal Mukherjee, and that's the last question. Go on, Payal.
Hello, Professor Bilgrami. It's great to hear your talk. My question is again related to the ashram. So is ashram a socially engineered aspirational space to facilitate a mechanics of unalienation through a creation of pre-accustomed frames of consistent thoughts through repetitive activities? Because when we are thinking of unalienation, we're repetitively coming to the ashram. And I cannot help myself think also a comparison of Aurobindo, Sri Aurobindo's ashram in this case as well. So.
Yeah, so the ashram is actually, a kind of I mean, one way to think of it is, you know, there's the standard way of thinking of it, which is not false, it's correct, which is that the ashram is part of what we understand as the decentralized, self-organizing rather than state-organized communities that Gandhi saw as essential to his alternative conception of of the polity, which of course was sidelined very early on, in fact, as early as the late 1930s by Nehru. But it's true that it's only, I mean, Gandhi explicitly says, it never occurs to us in the ashram, any one of us, that the others are not doing their bit, which is why I'm plucking out that particular remark of his about the ashram to pit against Hardin and a whole tradition of thinking about political economy. Gandhi didn't say it in the context of talking about political economy. It's my inference. But you see, well, the thing is that have you ever read the work of Elinor Ostrom?
A bit, yes.
You should read it because Elinor Ostrom is talking about governing the commons. And what's interesting about her work is that she wants to say that it's perfectly possible to not see governance in terms of the state, right? That there should be a kind of self-governance in local cooperative communities. But what I want to stress is something that I think Foucault misses in his critique of, is that my work in recent years, the last 2-3 years, is stressing a background of the non-discursive, which makes possible the discursive. And the thing that is, one of the things that made me see it is when I studied a little bit the kinds of things that Bishop Tutu and Mandela were saying about transitional justice in South Africa. So so this is part of scaling it up from just the ashram to larger canvases. See, what was Tutu and Mandela's, it was primarily Tutu's conception of that moment of transitional justice. What did he say? He said, look, we've got to live with these people who have oppressed us, right? We've got to live with them. We can't just treat them as somebody as hundreds of thousands of people to be incarcerated. So it can't be ordinary criminal law by which we judge them. Right? So what did they say? What did Tutu say? He said, let's not see this as just application of a law in a detached way, right? Where the accused sit silently in the dark. You bring evidence against them in this forensic understanding of the law, right? Objective, did they commit the crime, etc. He says, no, let's engage with them. Let them come out in a confessional mode, right? About their past wrongdoings. By engagement with us, not accusations, not making them sit silently in the dark, letting them speak and speaking with them. Trusting them to say what they did, right? So notions of trust, cooperativeness, etc. Let's just take it for granted that they will speak in the confessional mode. And once it comes out in this form of engagement, unalienated, first-person relations with them, right? First and second, not third, not seeing them. It'll come, and maybe we can have, and they call it a healing process. It wasn't punishment. They substituted the vocabulary of healing and so on. As I say, not law, not discursive, propositional, what the very things are. So they were saying, let let the things that make the law possible, all this background of trust and so on, that makes the application of the law, implementability of the law possible. Right? The law wouldn't be implementable if people were not able to people can always get around the law. They can always get around the law. I was just reading this recently of this wonderfully amusing incident of how this university had laws against the utterance of obscenity, rules, right? So students just wore T-shirts. 4 of them sat in rows, right? Where one had the letter F, one had the letter U, and they sat in rows of 4. They didn't violate any of the rules. So you can always finesse them. I mean, and the point is, you think of the bodyline series in cricket. No law was broken, but everybody agreed the cricket is not being played out there, right? So you have to have a background of trust and so on and so forth, which makes that, and that's what Gandhi was saying, is that you've got to find the locations and then scale it up to other frames or locations. So ashram is just one example. I'm saying it's everywhere. That kind of trust and cooperativeness is everywhere. People tell the truth by and large. I mean, you're walking on the street and you ask somebody the time. Are you going to say, I wonder if he's telling me the truth when he tells you? You just take things for granted. I'm saying this is, so it's not as if things replace one another in one episteme. I think they are interstices where you just take things for granted quite correctly. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the law. It's the Dionysian makes possible the Apollonian, the law, etc. So it's not just the ashram. Ashram is an example of what his more general philosophical point was.
Okay. So thank you so much, Professor Bilgrami, for a wonderful talk. I think I speak for all of us here when I say that this was really edifying and stimulating. Thanks everyone for joining the lecture, and also to everyone at Ahmedabad University who helped organize it. Thank you so much, and have a good night or good morning.